Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's ILTA YouTube video entitled Privacy by Design, Embedding Data Protection into Legal Tech Development. I'm your moderator, Arshaq, Manager of Information Security at Risk at Fasken Martineau. And we have a very special guest today. We are joined today by Dr. Norman Sadeh. He is the co-founder and co-director of the Privacy Engineering Program at Carnegie Mellon University. It is the first and by far the gold standard in privacy engineering programs, considered the best in the world. A lot of high caliber graduates from that program are working in all the big companies, tech and other industries, you name it. And we're really honored and appreciate Norman's time today. Norman, thank you for joining us for today's session.
Arshaq, thank you for having me. It's a delight to be on your program today.
Right. So today we're discussing privacy by design, and there's a lot of things happening in the privacy space. It's ever evolving. So a few questions on that topic. I guess we can start off with if you can touch upon the core principles that underpin privacy by design, and how does privacy by design differ, or what sets it apart from some other type of privacy approach, or going about it in a different way.
Yes, so privacy is a very challenging topic, as you mentioned. And traditionally, people would think of privacy as one of those annoying things that, you got to take care of, but perhaps develop the product first and then slap, privacy on top, maybe write a privacy policy, add a few controls, and then call it victory. That approach has been shown not to work and is almost guaranteed to get you in trouble. And so privacy by design is this realization that, boy, if we want to avoid these types of issues, we better start thinking about privacy from the very beginning, from the conception of the product or the services or the business processes, to the actual design, to the actual development, to the actual deployment, and even the phasing out of these products or services or business processes. And it's only if you approach things from that perspective that you're likely to reduce the chances of getting in trouble. And that requires a major shift in thinking within organizations, a major shift in operating, an approach that brings in many more roles into these processes. It's not just let's ask at the end the legal part of the organization to look at what we've done and figure a way to make it kosher. It's about, let's start again from the beginning. Let's involve all the different roles that will have something to do with making sure that we don't get in trouble. And getting in trouble itself can take multiple shapes and forms. Obviously, you want to be compliant with the laws, but increasingly, there's also a belief that perhaps you might want to go beyond that. The laws themselves are evolving, their interpretations are evolving, and so it's always best to try to think one step ahead and ask yourself, how should I develop this functionality, and what functionality do I want to offer? What data do I want to collect? How do I want to process that data to avoid getting my customers, my users, my data subjects upset? And so that's effectively what privacy by design is. Privacy by design is about trying to integrate all these considerations that have to do with privacy from a very early stage in the process, bringing together not just legal, but also the software developers, the product managers, the UX, UI people, the security engineers, these days, obviously the AI engineers as well, the software architects. All these different roles have something to say in this process and have to be involved from the very beginning if you want to avoid getting in trouble. The problem, obviously, in terms of implementing these things is that these different roles have been trained to think very differently. Their minds are operating differently, their priorities are different, the language that they use is different. So even if you bring in the same room someone with a legal background and a software engineer, and you say, hey guys, talk to one another for an hour and figure things out, they might just talk past one another. And so this is why we have privacy engineers these days, because the privacy engineers are really trained to orchestrate these discussions, to mediate these discussions, to help translate among these different languages that these different roles speak, document the process so that 6 months later we say, why did we do that? Well, here are the questions we answered. Here's the process we went through. Here's who signed off on this. Here's the analysis that was done. Are these assumptions still holding? Do we need to revise things because the laws have changed, the technology has changed, the third-party APIs and libraries that you're relying on in your software have changed? You know, are these assumptions still valid? If not, what needs to be modified? And so all that is part of privacy by design. I'm describing this at a very high level. I assume I'm going to let you ask me some follow-up questions, and then we're going to probably get a chance to go deeper into this.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I think there's a lot of focus on proactive, not reactive, built into those practices and approaches. So I guess for the ILTA audience specifically, because we're law firms, so just wondering if you can touch upon some ways that law firms or professional services organizations, or any organization for that matter, how they can assess what aspects of privacy by design to adopt first, if they can gain some quick wins, you know, any good suggestions on that note.
Yes, so many organizations do rely or should rely on outside counsel. Often, I mean, the larger organizations do not necessarily need to. They've got the expertise. But if you're looking at, you know, all the startups out there that try to develop new products, chances are they don't have the expertise in privacy. And so it's very common for people to say, maybe I need to talk to an attorney and, you know, get some advice at least as to what these regulations require. How do I interpret the text of these regulations? And these things keep on shifting. So law firms are often going to be, obviously they can be called to help at many different stages in the process. When it comes to privacy by design, making sure that the people, so let's assume that we're talking about a startup, for instance, right? So an organization that perhaps doesn't have a ton of expertise in that space. The attorneys should probably try as best as they can to make sure that people are aware of the risks, understand you know, the issues, realize there are very simple principles, right? So for instance, a lot of us nowadays are looking at AI solutions. The traditional thinking in AI has been that data is an asset. The more data you collect, the greater the models you're going to be able to develop, the more inferences you're going to make, the more value you're going to generate for your customers. The truth is, from a privacy standpoint, we like to think of data as also being a liability. The more data you collect, especially if you don't really need that data, is, you know, a sure way of getting in trouble. It's a liability, and you want to minimize the amount of data that you collect. You want to only collect the data that you really need, only retain it for as long as you need it, only share it, you know, when needed, only share it under the right provisions. Increasingly, regulations require you to think about all these things. So there are tons and tons of things that you would want to educate people about, depending obviously on their background, their level of expertise. If you're working with a more mature organization, and obviously not sure whether your question is for an outside counsel or perhaps an internal person with a legal background, but you want to make sure that people are at least aware of what they need to pay attention to. You want to make sure they've got some training in this area. There's a ton of training available out there. There's an organization obviously called IAPP, which is the International Association of Professionals in Privacy. And they offer a lot of quick training and certifications. We obviously have our own program, which is much more intensive, and we train people through master's degrees. We also offer our own certificates. And so those are ways of at least making sure that people are aware. The first stage in privacy, it's not necessarily about turning everybody into an expert. You cannot do that. Nobody has the time to, or most people don't necessarily have that sort of time. But at least make sure that people understand the risks that they're going to be dealing with. Make sure that they've got some awareness so that when they run into these types of situations, they know they need to ask for help, right? That would be, I think, the first step. So that, and there's a lot more to talk about. So I'm not sure that I necessarily answered your question fully here, but at least that's a bit of the flavor that you want to think about. There are more systematic processes that obviously law firms get involved in when they deal with outside with clients coming to them for privacy issues, making sure that you've got an inventory of all the data that you collect and what happens to that data. That by itself sounds so basic, and yet you'd be surprised by the number of organizations that do not necessarily know what they collect, for what purpose they collect, where it's being stored, who it's being shared with, for what purpose, for how long it's retained, all these sorts of issues that are fundamental to privacy and to being compliant. And then obviously beyond that, there are many more issues that need to be addressed eventually.
Thank you. Yeah, great points. I think if we focus a little bit more on for law firms, the technology professionals working at law firms, so this is more internal facing. So those who are on IT teams, cybersecurity teams, software development, and so on. What are some good practices or approaches that those technology teams can take for internal projects, embedding privacy into their processes and from a technological perspective, and if there's any challenges that they might face and how to try to overcome those from a tech team perspective.
So the more mature organizations have obviously privacy groups, and these privacy groups bring together a variety of different people, some with a legal background, obviously many privacy engineers, some of them trained formally, many others who've had to learn on the job as things went on. The first step is training, right? So making sure that people understand what those issues are. Not everybody needs to have the same level of training. So what you find in mature organizations is that you've got core groups of people who act in part as evangelists, experts providing internal training to different product teams, so that there's at least one person in each product team who acts as liaison with the core privacy team, gets back to them with questions, keeps them updated on the design of the product, checks things before it's too late. The last thing you want to do is come up with a full design or a full product and then go for the final stage of approval and realize that you've got a major issue that you had ignored. So you need to obviously have those liaisons. You need to make sure that they're trained. You need to make sure that everyone across the organization has some basic trainings, from the software developers to the UX, UI people, obviously the engineers, the security people, and so on. That's extremely critical. And then you need to put up processes in place, right? So you need to say, okay, when you're going to design, when you start working on a new product, right? These are the processes that we're going to have. This is the methodology that we're going to follow. Increasingly, people are looking at privacy threat modeling as a way of trying to take a more systematic approach to the design process, so that you go through a series of steps, with each step involving a series of questions, and you try to be very systematic in the way you ask all these different questions, document the answers that you got, making sure that all the relevant roles are involved in thinking about these questions, making sure that things are properly documented, and eventually making sure that these decisions, these design decisions, you follow through on them, so that when people actually build the software, that software is consistent with the decisions that were made, that you avoid, these language issues where people thought, oh, the lawyers told us that. We thought we did. We thought we built software that was consistent with that, except that that was not the case. So making sure that you've got these processes in place, making sure there's a lot of documentation. It can be heavy at times, but in truth, if you don't make that investment, right, you're going to get in trouble. And one thing that we've seen from a compliance standpoint is we've seen that, 10 years ago, the penalties for not being compliant were a joke. And that was not much of an incentive for companies to be compliant. Nowadays, with the introduction of new regulations in Europe, in California, in fact, all over the world these days, you've got much steeper penalties. And these penalties are intended to make sure that people are going to take these things more seriously. And when they do their calculations about cost and benefit, they start to realize that, boy, we better make that investment, because not making that investment will get us in real trouble, and the cost might actually be higher than making those investments up front. So it's in part about recognizing that the penalties are steeper, recognizing also that you're going to be under more scrutiny these days, and customers can also get very upset when they find out things they don't like.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think these are really important considerations. I guess translating it to from an implementation perspective, is there value in taking sort of a phased approach, piloting a few, maybe on a few projects or some aspects of the privacy principles? Obviously, there's 7 principles, but there's no one approach that works for all. So sample it, see how it goes. Would you say there's value in that? And are there any metrics or measures of success that can be put in so to build upon that and build the case forward?
Yes. So privacy by design is something you have to do these days. So it's not an option where you say, okay, this project we're going to do privacy by design, this project we're not. At the same time, privacy by design is a journey. It's not really a destination. This has to do with the fact that our understanding of what needs to be done to do a good job at privacy keeps on evolving. Obviously, the regulations themselves are evolving. The interpretation of these regulations is also evolving. But the methodologies and the technologies that are available today to also support companies as they go through these new processes are evolving themselves. A big part of all this is, what people refer to as best practices. But best practices is a recognition that, you've got all these requirements, and many of these requirements these days in privacy are fairly aspirational in nature. When you look at regulations like CCPA or GDPR, for instance, coming out of Europe, the General Data Protection Regulation, these regulations, specify things at a pretty high level. And how well we can do in terms of meeting these requirements is evolving over time as new methodologies arise, as new technologies arise, right? So, nowadays when we teach privacy, we talk about technologies that 10 years ago were not really on the radar, things like differential privacy. How do you collect data and, somehow manipulate that data to minimize the risk that people can be re-identified while retaining value in that data? Those are new technologies that have just emerged really over the past 10 years, but that are very practical these days and that can be used in a number of different contexts. In the context of machine learning, people are doing federated learning, for instance, which is the idea that you don't necessarily need to centralize all your data in one repository. You can actually do machine learning on different devices, perhaps on cell phones, without necessarily sharing the user's detailed data with a central server and still come up with interesting models. So all those things are basically enriching this space, making it obviously more challenging, but also making it possible for organizations to do a better job at meeting these regulatory requirements. And so, yes, it's more of a journey than a set up of objectives. At the end of the day, obviously, as an organization, from a practical standpoint, you need to say, well, when do we declare victory? What is acceptable? So as an organization, you have to decide, and obviously these privacy groups have a big role to play here. You've got to decide what is considered to be sufficient. In general, if a regulator is going to look at what you have done and you look like you've tried very hard, you're much less likely to get in trouble or at least get slapped with the worst possible penalties than if you look like you were very sloppy and said, well, we decided this was good enough and we moved on. And so each organization has to decide for itself, obviously, what that means in practice. Ideally, have common standards across all your different products. There's no point in going farther with one product and not doing the same with a different product. That's also a good recipe for potentially getting you in trouble. And then over time, keep on trying to raise the bar by training your people, gaining more internal experience in terms of what it takes to do this right, and then keep on improving. It's really a journey, as I said earlier.
Thank you, Norman. So it sounds like it's you need to take a very customized approach and put it in the form of a program, really to build upon over time. And that speaks to your point on it's really a journey. So a lot of great insights there, Norman. We really appreciate that. It looks like this is a journey that we should undertake. In fact, probably don't have much of a choice. There's a lot of things evolving. AI obviously is a big thing these days. So whether it's traditional sort of technology projects or more sort of ones on the cutting edge, if you will, and in the AI space, privacy is still a very important consideration. So thank you for this very valuable insight information. Before we wrap up today, Norman, we would like to, if you will, to hear about Carnegie Mellon's privacy engineering program and what it offers, and what someone is looking for, where they can get the information.
Well, thank you for asking. So as you pointed out, we were the first ones to recognize the need for a program that trains privacy engineers. This was a result of conversations that we had with many companies back around 2010 or so. where we didn't have a master's program. We only had PhDs, and PhDs, you only produce so many of them per year. And so organizations that wanted to hire our students were very frustrated that we didn't have more to offer. And through conversations, we realized that perhaps what they needed was not necessarily PhDs, but rather people with a master's degree capable of applying all these concepts in a practical context. And so we spent quite a bit of time talking to all these organizations, the more mature organizations at the time, the Google, Microsofts, and others, and understanding what their needs were. And we developed a curriculum that was intended to make sure that we train people with the right background. That curriculum has continued to evolve. We obviously continue to talk to these and many organizations. We've got the benefit now of having graduated many students who work at a variety of different organizations, and we hear back from them as well. So that master's program initially was started as a 12-month program. And what we quickly came to realize, and so what do we cover in that program? We cover obviously regulations. Most of the people who start this program have a technical background. They've at least done some software development at some point, or at least they can read code fairly well. They've got a little bit of mathematical sophistication. They understand statistics and those kinds of things that are really critical these days also when it comes to privacy. But beyond regulations, we train them also in security. We train them in what we call now mathematics of privacy, or foundations of privacy, technologies like differential privacy, technologies like fairness, for instance, that also have very deep mathematical underpinnings. We train them in usable privacy and security. A lot of the privacy requirements these days, if you've got to comply with them, involve dealing with things like dark patterns, involved with making sure that choices, for instance, under CCPA, the California laws, are easily accessible. And all these things are obviously usability issues fundamentally. We train them in that space. We obviously train them in terms of privacy engineering per se. So how do you ensure that as you design and develop software, you end up with software that complies with the privacy decisions that you have made and complies with regulations. The program ends with capstone projects. So we work with client organizations that sponsor projects. These are real projects that are truly of interest to them. They actually pay to have students work on that. And the students work on this for a full semester. And once they complete that, they're ready to go and work in the industry, and they get many offers and they move on. And so that has worked very well. We've been doing this now for over 10 years, as I pointed out. But then eventually we came to realize that there were all these additional people out there who already had well-paying jobs and could not afford to come and spend a year at Carnegie Mellon. And so in response to that, we also decided to offer a part-time program, which people can take remotely. It takes more than 12 to 16 months, which is the time for the full-time program. And we also now have a certificate program that we introduced 2 years ago that has been tremendously successful. So we offer multiple cohorts a year. We've already had several hundred people go through that certificate program. And that's effectively 4 weekends, 6 hours per weekend, 3 hours on Saturday, 3 hours on Sunday, where we provide people with an overview of all the key concepts we cover in the master's program. It's not as deep, but it's proven to be very, very valuable for people who cannot afford to come and spend a full year with us. And so that has also been in very, very high demand recently. Any questions? I hope this was not too long, and I appreciate the opportunity to talk a bit about our privacy program.
Yeah, thank you, Norman. I mean, it's obviously a gold standard in the privacy engineering space, and it's great to hear that there's different modes that this is offered. For those who can dedicate full-time, studies to working professionals, all different full-time, part-time options, as well as certificates. So that's really great to hear, and I really appreciate that. So. On that note, that's our session for today. Norman, I want to thank you again very much for your time. It was a great session. We had a lot of great insights into the privacy by design. There's a lot that is underneath that, but I hope that for our audience, I want to thank you for tuning in, and hope this provides some good information into the privacy by design topic, as well as privacy engineering as a practice. And obviously the great insights shared by Norman and the great work that they do at Carnegie Mellon. Norman, thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you very much, Arshaq. Very nice chatting with you.
All right. Thanks all. And that concludes our program for today.